美国国会今年1月成立众议院美国与中国共产党战略竞争特设委员会。这个由2党议员组成的委员会，专门聚焦讨论华盛顿和北京之间有关安全、经济和人权等一系列的议题，并为立法者提出政策建议。委员会的主席来自威斯康辛州的共和党联邦众议员麦克·加拉格尔。在最近接受了美国之音记者李义华的专访，针对美国的印太战略、台湾安全、中国跨境镇压以及美中关系未来走向等问题，提出了他的解析和看法。下面请看专访的完整内容。
Thank you, Congressman Gallagher, for speaking with Voice of America. There are so many issues between U.S. and China we can discuss today. Later, we're going to talk about Taiwan and human rights issue, but I would like to start off with a broader picture of U.S.-China relations. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is going to visit Washington later this week. What are the most important topics you would like to see the administration raise in the meetings?
Well, I think the most important topic is cross-strait deterrence, and it seems that Xi Jinping is preparing his country for a war over Taiwan. He's repeatedly said that he wants to take Taiwan by force if necessary, and that's something we need to deter. We need to prevent him from doing that. A conflict between the United States and China would be incredibly costly. It's not something we want, but all the more reason why we need to send a strong message that the increasing aggression against Taiwan will not be tolerated. We will help Taiwan defend itself, and we will do whatever is necessary to defend our own interests in the Indo-Pacific. Beyond that, I would hope that the administration urges the Chinese Communist Party to take more aggressive action when it comes to cracking down on the production of fentanyl precursors. Fentanyl is flooding across the southern border and it's killing tens of thousands of Americans, and ultimately it can be traced back to China. That's unacceptable. And finally, I hope we don't deprioritize the issue of human rights, whether it is the ongoing genocide in Xinjiang, whether it's the, let's say, economic coercion that's happening globally, whether it's the ongoing suppression of Hong Kongers. There are important human rights issues that the administration needs to raise during these meetings.
We're seeing more high-level official communications between U.S. and China. Do you think that signals a smoother and maybe more pragmatic path for U.S.-China relations?
I don't. I think the administration is trying to revive diplomatic and economic engagement in the hope of taking down the temperature, but I think the opposite is happening. It seems that the more we rush or bend over backwards to sit down at a table with Xi Jinping or some other high-level CCP member, the more aggressive the CCP becomes. And we shelve or delay critical defensive action, whether it's ending the licensing exemptions that we provide for Chinese companies like Huawei, or providing transparency on the spy balloon incident, or actually investigating the origins of COVID. We delay these actions for fear of offending the Chinese Communist Party in the hopes that they will reciprocate in kind, and they never do. They continue to hack high-level official emails. They continue to undermine our grid and our infrastructure in cyberspace. They continue to threaten Taiwan. All of these things are unacceptable. And so I worry that this policy of engagement, what I've called zombie engagement, will actually have the opposite effect. It will actually make the CCP more aggressive, and we will lose time that we need to start defending ourselves from CCP aggression.
Given the current conflict in Israel and the ongoing war in Ukraine, how would that affect the U.S. capability to focus on China or Indo-Pacific and then the threats posed by the CCP?
Well, it should be a wake-up call to the West. Increasingly, it looks like we have an axis of authoritarian powers that are arrayed against our interests and those of our allies. China is the dominant player in this partnership. Vladimir Putin is a junior partner. But increasingly, there's collaboration with Iran. These are murderous dictatorial regimes that are threatening our allies. Putin has obviously invaded Ukraine. Hamas has now attacked Israel, killed over 30 Americans, and it could not have done so without the long-standing financial and training support it's received from Iran. So this should be a wake-up call. I don't believe those who say that it's an either-or choice between resources in Europe, resources in the Middle East, or resources in the Indo-Pacific. This should be an opportunity for us to revitalize and rebuild our defense industrial base, which we've neglected for too long, to once again become the arsenal of democracy and deterrence. And, if nothing else, to learn the lessons of the failure of deterrence in Ukraine and ensure that those failures are not repeated in the Indo-Pacific region. And in my mind, the primary lesson is that hard power, American hard power, gives us our best chance of deterring totalitarian aggression. And if we don't surge hard power to the Pacific now, before it's too late, we could see a PLA invasion of Taiwan, and it would have the potential to make the ongoing wars in Ukraine and Israel look timid in comparison.
Mm-hmm. You talked about Taiwan a little bit earlier already, but let's move on to Taiwan issues. Taiwan is probably the most volatile flashpoint between US and China. And you've said in statements and various occasions that we are in the window of maximum danger when it comes to a potential conflict with China over Taiwan. This window of maximum danger will kick off in earnest following the Taiwan elections in January next year. Why do you think Taiwan will face the maximum threat from Beijing after its election next year?
Well, I think a few things. One, if you look at sort of the economic and demographic issues that China is facing, they will become most acute in the 2030s, which means if Xi Jinping is serious about wanting to not pass this problem on to the next generation, to use his phrase, and to forcibly take Taiwan if necessary, he'll have to do it in this decade. This may be the best chance he gets. And if the DPP wins in January, he may conclude that he can't achieve this objective via political warfare, so therefore he has to choose actual warfare. If you look at our capabilities and our budget situation in America this decade, we have a lot of acute crises that are coming to bear right now. We have to recapitalize our Navy. Our Navy is set to get to its lowest point, 279 ships roughly, by 2027, which is precisely the year that Xi Jinping has set as having the PLA capable of taking Taiwan. So sometime in between the election in 2024 and 2027, I fear could be a moment when Xi Jinping decides, due to a combination of his own capabilities, potentially our capabilities, that he could actually achieve this and achieve his military objective. All the more reason why we need to be focusing on near-term deterrence to make sure that every day he wakes up and he looks across the Taiwan Strait, he concludes that today is not the day.
What factors do you think will play into Beijing's calculation for any actions against Taiwan?
The most important factor is the hard power that we have in the Indo-Pacific. What is the actual size of the Navy, long-range precision fires that we have in the Pacific, the capabilities of our key allies, particularly in the first island chain with Japan and the Philippines, and obviously the Australians with the AUKUS agreement, though that's not the first island chain. The other thing I have to concede, in addition to the investments we in Congress make in the military, I think presidential leadership matters a great deal. Who the commander-in-chief is, how the commander-in-chief carries himself, what the commander-in-chief says, really does affect the calculus of our allies. It affects the calculus of our enemies. And there I worry that President Biden has provided inconsistent leadership at best. My hope is that we get a stronger commander-in-chief come January of 2025, but we'll see how the election shakes out.
Let's move on to transnational repressions. It's one of the most important topics that the Select Committee cares about deeply. And why do you think China's transnational repression and then the CCP's long-arm repression should be a matter of concern for American people?
Well, I think it should remind us that the problems with the Chinese Communist Party and the threat it poses is not confined to the borders of China. It is not just a problem that the Chinese Communist Party is oppressing Chinese citizens inside of China or committing a genocide against the Uyghurs. Increasingly, we see that Las Vegas rules do not apply. What happens there will not stay there, that they are trying to export their model of techno-totalitarian control around the world. And I do think that the CCP's ambitions are not just internal, they're not just regional, they're actually global. And the fact that they have no respect for our sovereignty and they're willing to do things like set up illegal police stations in the heart of Manhattan or to leverage harmless sounding student associations to harass and surveil Taiwanese and Chinese students on American university campuses tells us that they do not respect our borders and they want to export their totalitarian oppression on our own soil and those of our allies. That's something we can't stand for. It's something we have to push back. And we have a duty to defend our own citizens. We have a duty to make sure that America is a haven from persecution, not a hunting ground for authoritarians.
Earlier this year, you led a rally against the CCP police station in New York City, and then you gave a strong speech there. Is there any reason you feel so strongly about this issue?
I think because America stands for certain values. We are incredibly fortunate in this country to be at a moment where, due to a combination of our model of government, our economic power, some of our natural advantages, that we are still looked to as leader of the free world. But being leader of the free world means you need to stand up for freedom, right? I was incredibly moved and touched when I saw the protests in Hong Kong a few years ago, and you had tens of thousands, not millions of people coming into the streets, and a lot of them were waving American flags, which tells me that people still look to America to uphold values that are not just American values, they're universal values. Self-expression, freedom, dignity, all of these are things I think we have a duty, given how fortunate we've been in this country, to defend, not just within our borders, but around the world.
Well, pushing back China's influence, CCP's influence, Ranking Member Congressman Krishnamurthy said before that we must avoid anti-Chinese and then Asian stereotyping at all costs. How do you address the concern that ordinary Chinese and then Chinese Americans can be caught in crossfire?
I think in a few ways. One, we have to constantly distinguish between the Chinese Communist Party. It's why I asked then Speaker McCarthy to rename the committee to focus on the party. The threat we face comes from the party. This is indeed a party state. You have sort of a Leninist party structure that sits on top of the state structure that then controls the people. But we have no quarrel with the people. So making the distinction between the party and the people, rhetorically and in practice, I think is the most important thing we can do. I also think we have to be conscious of the dangers of going overboard. We don't want to overstate our case. So while we have concerns, for example, about illegal Chinese police stations in America, that's not to say there can't be any sort of Chinese association, as long as it's not being used by the party to oppress Asian Americans on American soil. And then I do think it's important to try, wherever possible, to build our policy on a bipartisan foundation. It's why I think Congress has such an important role to play here, because Congress, by legislating solutions to the China challenge, can build that foundation in a way that transcends any particular presidency. Put differently, the presidency may go from Democrat to Republican, but if Congress steps up and identifies and builds that foundation for U.S. foreign policy, I think it can avoid going overboard, but also be stronger as a result of having both parties bought into it.
Do you feel that you see a heightened awareness about the CCP threat in the U.S.?
I do. I think we've had a lot of high-profile incidents, probably the high profile of which was the pandemic itself, which obviously affected everybody in America. It altered our way of life. It killed millions of people, and obviously it came from China, most likely from a lab in Wuhan. Now, people can argue about that, but there's no argument that the Chinese Communist Party did everything possible to cover up the origins of COVID. And that obfuscation, that cover-up, cost us days, weeks, months, and ultimately millions of lives. And a regime that does something like that, I think, is a regime that cannot be trusted, and I think your average American is waking up to that fact. Other incidents include the spy balloon incident, which of course, the CCP's explanation for it was laughable. The idea that this was just some sort of scientific balloon that went rogue doesn't withstand basic scrutiny. Incidents we've talked about with police stations. I went to Iowa, for example, and there they've dealt with intellectual property theft, Chinese agents stealing seeds from fields in Iowa in order to reverse engineer the technology. All of these things combined, add on to it just the increasing aggression in the Indo-Pacific region, I think conspire to have woken up a lot of Americans, and it's why you see Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill paying attention to the CCP threat.
The Select Committee has been established for about 10 months. What are the key China issues the committee is going to plan to focus on in the future?
Well, right now, so our first report was on kind of military issues and cross-strait deterrence in Taiwan. Our second report was on human rights and the genocide in Xinjiang. Right now, we're hoping to finalize our third report, which would be about the economic and technological dimensions of our competition. That, in some ways, I think, is the most complex aspect of this competition because unlike, let's say, our competition with the Soviet Union in the old Cold War, we never had to contemplate a form of economic decoupling because our economies didn't interact. But with China, we're so thoroughly intertwined after decades of trying to integrate China to the global economy. It creates a lot of dilemmas for U.S. policy. So we're trying to work through that. It's difficult, but I'm hoping that we'll come up with a bipartisan set of policy recommendations when it comes to economic and technological competition. Beyond that, we're still going to have a series of hearings shining a light on the CCP threat. And as we move into next year, my hope is to use the committee to potentially tackle some of the longer range issues that don't get as much attention in Congress or in the White House because we tend to be dominated by the urgent issues of the moment. So for example, a productive debate about what is the overall goal of our policy over the long term? Are we seeking some form of constrainment or behavior change of the CCP, to quote Matt Pottinger? Are we seeking a stable balance of power within the region? Is there some other goal that we're seeking? I think that would be, because I don't think the White House has actually articulated the long-term goal with respect to China. I think that might be a productive role for us, as well as to explore some of these other niche issues that haven't gotten as much attention.
And then our last question. Many viewers of VOA actually have to overcome the firewall in China to watch this interview, to read our content. Is there any message that you would like to say to our viewers and listeners in China?
I would say to the Chinese people that you have a lot of friends here in America. And we want to stand with the Chinese people against the predations of the Chinese Communist Party. And America seeks peace. We don't want a conflict with China over Taiwan, but we need the party to stop its aggression. And ultimately, America is going to defend our values. And as I said before, these are our values that should be universal on some level.
Thank you so much, Congressman Gallagher.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Really appreciate your time.
Yeah,
Thank you.